The grand hall of stars inside the Villari Dominion's royal palace was brighter than ever, with its glass dome showing the twin suns glowing outside and the planets of the inner system twinkling beyond. Today was not an ordinary gathering. Today, Princess Aralea, daughter of the ruling matron, was to choose a consort among the selected suitors from powerful worlds. For the sake of peace and future trade, it was more than marriage. It was diplomacy sealed in bloodlines. She stood tall on the elevated dais, her silver robes flowing like liquid light, her golden eyes scanning the men before her. Every suitor had brought gifts, words, titles, and flawless bloodlines, but none impressed her. She listened, nodded politely, then dismissed them with a wave of her hand. Then came Earth's offering. The hall grew quiet when Elias Rourke entered. He wore no ceremonial armor, no glittering cloak only, a simple dark suit, marked with Earth's blue and green crest. He didn't bow deeply or speak grand phrases. He simply looked up at Aralea, his posture calm, his face unreadable, his eyes the color of faded storm clouds. The nobles whispered among themselves, "A human, not even of noble rank? An insult." Aralea narrowed her eyes, annoyed, confused, even a little curious. Elias stepped forward, hands behind his back, saying only, "I was asked to come. I won't lie to you. I'm not a prince, and I don't want to be one. But I believe peace between our people matters. And I'm here because I think you do too." The silence that followed was sharp and full of tension. Several counselors shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or gasp. Aralea stared at him for a long moment, her lips parted slightly. Then she stood. Her voice rang out clear and sharp. "The Princess of Velar does not marry weaklings." Murmurs broke out immediately. Elias didn't flinch. He only nodded, slightly turned to leave, and walked away without another word. Aralea stood frozen. She had expected protest, maybe desperation, maybe anger, but this quiet acceptance unsettled her. As he left, her gaze followed him. She didn't speak again, until the hall emptied. That night she didn't sleep. In her private quarters she replayed the moment in her mind, his eyes, his voice, his strange confidence. Her hand hovered over a glowing data pad, listing the suitor's files. When she reached his, she hesitated, then opened it. She read about his past, an ex-soldier, wounded in border wars, now a cultural liaison for the Earth Coalition. No family left. Volunteered for peace missions. No glory-seeking. Just work. Just purpose. She closed the file, but something stayed in her mind. The next day, she delayed all meetings. She walked through the palace gardens, but found no peace. Her thoughts were filled with questions she could not ask. Why did the human's words stay with her when all the other's flattery had vanished like smoke? Why had her voice caught when she looked into his eyes? At noon, she climbed to the observation bridge, high above the city, where only royals were allowed. And there, to her surprise, she saw him, Elias, alone, watching the skies. He had somehow found his way in without, guards stopping him. She should have summoned security, but instead she stepped closer, keeping her distance. He didn't turn. "I thought I wasn't welcome," he said calmly, still looking at the stars. "You're not," she replied, but her voice was softer than intended. He smiled faintly. "Then why are you here?" She didn't answer. For the first time in her life, she felt unsure of herself, not because she feared the man, but because she couldn't read him. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't hiding fear. He simply was, as if he had nothing to lose. Something inside her shifted. A question formed on her lips, but she held it back. Instead, she turned and left. That evening, the council asked her to continue interviews with the remaining suitors. She agreed, but her mind was elsewhere. That night, in the shadows of the palace, a cloaked figure slipped through the quiet halls to Elias's chamber. He had sensed the presence even before the knock. He opened the door and saw her, the princess. She wore a hood, her expression unreadable. She stepped inside, said nothing for several moments, then whispered one word, "Why?" Elias looked at her, puzzled. "Why what?" She met his eyes. "Why did you come? Why did you speak to me that way? Without fear?" Elias paused, then sighed, "Because fear doesn't build peace. Respect does. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." Aralea stared at him, then nodded once, and left as silently as she had come. That night, she didn't return to her chambers. She walked the sky bridges alone, trying to understand the strange pull she felt toward the human. She remembered every detail of his face, his voice, his calm. Something in her heart whispered that things were changing, but she didn't know yet how much, and beyond the palace walls others were watching. Some smiled in shadow, others sharpened their knives. The choosing ceremony was not over, but the real test had just begun. The next morning, the royal court buzzed with confusion as Princess Aralea delayed the continuation of the suitor ceremonies without giving a reason, an act unheard of in Velari tradition, and while nobles murmured and speculated, none dared question her directly, for her silence carried more weight than 1,000 royal commands. Meanwhile, Elias Rourke, the human outsider, was ordered to remain in the palace under the excuse of diplomatic observation, though he knew it was more likely they simply didn't know what to do with him, and he didn't mind. He preferred watching, learning, and moving quietly anyway, especially in places where eyes followed him like shadows, and whispers chased every step he took. The palace was massive and beautiful, carved from shimmering crystal and woven with silver vines of biolite, and though the beauty impressed him, Elias sensed tension beneath the surface, something heavy that hung in the air like a storm waiting to fall. As he moved through gardens and hanging bridges, he often caught glimpses of royal guards pretending not to watch him, but more curious were the moments when he felt another kind of gaze, softer, sharper, and full of questions, and once or twice when he turned around, he thought he saw the shadow of flowing robes disappearing around corners. On the third day he entered the ancient library where only scholars and bloodline heirs walked freely, and the librarians hesitated at first, but allowed him in after a quiet order from the royal crest was delivered by drone, though no one said who sent it, and deep in the scroll wing, between shelves that whispered history and power, he found a figure standing alone by a window, staring at the horizon. Princess Aralea. For a moment he thought of turning away, but she didn't move, didn't speak, just stood in the golden light like a statue, until finally she said, without turning, "You walk like a soldier, but you study like a priest," and Elias stepped closer, unsure if it was a question or an observation, replying quietly, "I've been both, in a way," which made her glance over her shoulder. her eyes not cold this time, but full of something harder to name, curiosity, maybe, or doubt. She asked him then about Earth, not its politics or its power, but its past, and he spoke of oceans and wars and cities rebuilt again and again, of people who argued constantly but still reached for the stars, and Aralea listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, though something in her posture softened, and after a long silence she asked, "Why do you speak like your planet matters when it has so little?" And Elias simply said, "Because it does to us," and she didn't answer but walked away slowly, her silence louder than words. That night he returned to his quarters and found his door open, nothing taken, but the position of the datapad slightly moved, and he knew someone had searched through his files. Rather than alert the guards, he let it go and placed an old Earth photo, a black and white image of his late sister, smiling in the rain on the desk as bait. The next day it was gone, replaced with a crystal flower only found in Villari's royal gardens, which confused him more than anything else had. As the days passed, Aralea appeared more frequently in unexpected places, never officially, never with guards or ceremony, but always watching, always listening, never speaking much. The other suitors noticed the shift, too, and while they didn't speak it aloud, their stares grew sharper, their tones colder, and the older members of the council began questioning whether the princess was compromising her role with such behavior, though no one dared challenge her directly. Behind closed doors, some whispered that the human had cast a spell, while others believed he was simply a trickster using sympathy to confuse the royal line. Elias remained quiet, kept his distance, but he felt the tension rise around him like a net drawing tighter, and more than once he caught conversations cut short when he entered a room, or subtle signs that someone was tracking his movements. One evening, as he walked past the outer gardens, he noticed that the lanterns flickered in an odd pattern, 3 short. 2 long, 1 short again, a military code he hadn't seen since the war, and he paused, alert, scanning the area, until he spotted a figure leaning against the marble archway, arms crossed. Aralea, again. This time she looked different, not regal, not guarded, but tired, and she asked softly, "Do you think I'm cruel?" Which took him by surprise, and he replied, "No, but I think you carry too many voices in your head that aren't your own." And for a long while she said nothing, just looked at the stars, and when she finally spoke, her words were almost lost in the wind. "I rejected all of them because they talked like conquerors. But you don't talk like a man who wants power. You talk like a man who's already lost everything." And Elias felt a chill run through him, not from fear, but from recognition, as if a part of himself had been laid bare by a stranger. Before he could respond, a sharp crack sounded in the distance, and both turned as a flash lit the sky, a security flare, used only in emergencies, and without thinking, Elias grabbed her arm and pulled her behind cover, instinct guiding him. Before logic could catch up, guards arrived seconds later, shouting reports of a drone breach near the northern wall, and while no one was hurt, the implication was clear. Someone had tried to test the palace's defenses, or worse, send a message. Aralea didn't speak again that night, but when she left, she gave Elias a long look, one that made it clear something had shifted, not just in her, but between them. The next morning, word spread that the suitor ceremonies had been suspended, indefinitely, and the nobles demanded answers, but the princess offered none, her silence now not just personal, but political. The council feared instability, the nobles feared scandal, and the other suitors feared irrelevance, but none could force her hand. Only Elias, sitting alone in the crystal garden with his datapad unread, understood the truth that something had begun, something neither of them could stop, and someone else in the palace didn't want it to continue. Elias sat on the edge of the reflecting pool in the eastern gardens, his eyes watching the ripple of water disturbed by falling petals from the tall shimmer trees. But his mind wasn't calm. He had sensed the shift, not just in Aralea, but in the whole palace, as if everything was now holding its breath, waiting for something to break. And though no one said it aloud, Elias knew the change in the princess's behavior had drawn attention far beyond the velvet halls and golden balconies. She was being watched not just by suitors or counselors, but by forces older than the throne itself, and Elias had seen such things before: quiet threats dressed as tradition, silences that carried more danger than shouting ever could. The palace had become colder in spirit, though the air remained warm, and servants moved with cautious steps, as if afraid of being caught in something larger than themselves, while Elias noticed how conversations stopped when he passed, and how guards no longer looked at him directly, but never looked away either. Still, the princess continued to find him sometimes in the library, sometimes in the gardens, once even on the high terrace where ships landed, and each time she said little, sometimes nothing at all, but remained near him, her eyes searching, her posture slowly changing from regal to something more grounded, something more human. One evening she asked him quietly, "Do humans ever stop feeling grief?" And Elias answered with equal softness, "No, but we learn how to live with it." And Aralea didn't speak again for several minutes, her gaze lost in the stars above, as if trying to understand pain as something more than weakness. After that she asked more about Earth, not its politics or weapons, but its people, its music, its food, even its stories, and Elias told her of old tales, of lovers separated by war, of explorers who vanished into the unknown, of parents who gave everything for children they never saw grow up. And each story seemed to peel away another layer of her distance, until her voice became softer, her questions more curious, her eyes more open. But not everyone welcomed this closeness, and Elias knew it one night. Returning to his room, he found a coded message burned faintly into the mirror. "Go home before you are buried here." And though no one claimed it, he knew it wasn't just a warning, but a promise. Still, he didn't leave, and Aralea didn't ask him to, though she seemed more guarded after that, her visits shorter, her words slower, until one day she came without speaking at all, simply handing him a small crystal square, the kind used only by the royal line for private memories, and when Elias activated it, he saw a vision of her as a child standing alone in a vast hall, surrounded by voices but touched by none, her eyes wide, her expression unreadable, and he understood then what kind of loneliness she carried, not the kind born from absence, but the kind born from duty, from always being watched, always being measured. After that, something between them grew stronger, something unspoken, and it frightened others. Nobles whispered more. Counselors began scheduling closed meetings, and even the royal guards moved with extra alertness. Meanwhile, Elias started receiving private messages from Earth's diplomatic command, asking if he had compromised the mission or endangered planetary relations, but he ignored them, knowing they wouldn't understand not the weight of silence. In this palace, not the eyes that followed him now, not with curiosity, but with calculation. And then came the attack, not an open one, but precise, quiet, and almost fatal. A toxin slipped into his tea, disguised perfectly, but Elias's military instincts saved him when the bitter aftertaste struck his tongue just moments before. He swallowed, and he spilled the cup before collapsing into a fevered state that lasted hours, during which he saw flashes of memories, dreams, and something else. Aralia's face, not stern or distant, but close, her hands cool against his skin, her voice low and urgent, calling his name again and again. When he awoke, weak but breathing, she sat beside him, her royal crest gone, her robe simple, and her eyes darker than he'd ever seen them, not with anger, but fear. She whispered, "You should have left," and Elias replied, voice dry, "You didn't want me to." And she said nothing, but her hand remained in his, and that silence meant everything. After that, the palace grew even colder. The ceremonies were cancelled altogether, and the matron, Aralia's mother, summoned her to private council daily, and rumors spread like wildfire that the princess had chosen a human, that she had lost her path, that she had been bewitched. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. Aralia had begun to question everything, and Elias had become the mirror she never had, showing her a life not built on control or legacy, but on choice, even pain. And still, unknown to both, a deeper threat moved beneath them, a faction within the council, long hidden, who believed humans were beneath the dominion, who saw the potential bond between Aralia and Elias not as scandal, but as heresy. They began planning, not to kill him outright, but to undo him from within, to find a way to frame him, to make the galaxy see him as a spy, a traitor, a manipulator who sought to take the throne through seduction, and Aralia as weak, broken by human charm. The plot grew quietly, feeding on fear and pride, and Elias, slowly recovering, began to sense it in the air, in the way guards changed shifts more often, in how his datapad now took longer to access the public network, and how some of the servants no longer made eye contact. And one night, as he stood alone on the garden wall, Aralia appeared again, her hair loose for the first time, her expression tired, and she whispered, "They're going to force me to choose again soon." And Elias said, "You don't have to play their game." But she only replied, "It's not a game when your people think your heart belongs to an outsider." And he asked her softly, "Does it?" And she didn't answer with words, only reached for his hand, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. And somewhere high above, in a hidden chamber of the council tower, a new order was being prepared, stamped with red seal. Neutralize the human, discredit the bond, restore tradition. Elias and Aralia had no idea what was coming, but the silence between them was no longer fear. It was resolve. The palace grew colder, not in temperature but in spirit, as whispers filled the halls like smoke, slipping beneath doors and curling around stone columns, feeding on secrets and turning eyes sharp with suspicion. For the royal court of Velaria was not built only on power, it thrived on control, and the moment control faltered, old blood stirred from its long slumber. Aralia, once the image of perfect nobility, now walked through her own palace like a ghost among statues. Her presence once revered, now questioned behind closed doors, and the nobles, bound by tradition and fear, watched with narrowed eyes as she continued to appear near Elias, the human, the outsider, whose presence had become both scandal and symbol. Every step he took now echoed louder than before, not because he walked differently, but because everyone listened harder, hoping for a misstep they could seize upon, and Elias felt it, the shift in the air, the invisible hands pulling strings. He could not see, but whose effect he could feel like pressure behind his eyes. The council, ancient and still, began moving again, not in public sessions, but in deep rooms lit by violet fire, where rules were bent in shadow and old names whispered as warnings, and among them rose one voice louder than the rest counselor. Vulture, born of royal blood and old money, a man who had once hoped his own bloodline might touch the throne through arranged union, and whose pride now burned hotter than politics. He saw Elias not as a man, but as a crack in the crystal of Velari purity, and he moved like poison, slowly and without warning, calling in favors, reviving ancient laws, and reminding the others what had happened the last time a ruler ignored. The will of the people's civil war, long buried but never forgotten. Elias, meanwhile, kept mostly to the quiet corners of the palace, his presence now under guard, not for protection, but containment, and yet Aralea still found him, often under starlight, where walls could not listen and shadows could not lie. And each time they met, she looked more torn, not unsure of him, but unsure of herself, torn between heart and throne, between what she felt and what she was born to carry. And one night, as they stood by the moonvine arch, she said in a whisper, "They're preparing something. They won't move against you openly, not yet, but they will discredit you first." And Elias nodded, already expecting it, for he had felt it in the changed tones of the guards, in the way servants now offered things twice, watching to see if he accepted anything without scanning it first. The next day, his communications were blocked without explanation, Earth's messages no longer reaching him, and when he questioned the palace AI, it responded with a neutral tone, diplomatic signal review pending security clearance, which meant nothing and everything. Later that week, a council session was called without the princess, an illegal move, but one made under the guise of national emergency, and Vulture stood before the other members with a file he claimed contained evidence of Elias's involvement. In planetary espionage, forged images, half-truths, stitched with professional skill, painting Elias as a manipulator sent to sway the throne, and while some doubted it, most remained silent, unwilling to oppose Vulture until more proof emerged. Elias was summoned the next morning to the reflection chamber, not as a guest, but as an accused, and though no one said the word traitor, the implication rang through every question posed. Aralea was not present, her absence arranged by protocol that had conveniently scheduled her to lead a diplomatic session far from the palace, and Elias, standing alone beneath the great crystal dome, answered every question with calm precision. But it wasn't logic the council wanted. It was fear, it was doubt, and when they didn't find it in him, they accused it anyway, sealing his clearance and restricting his movement to the West Wing under review. But what they didn't know was that Aralea had anticipated it, and she had prepared a failsafe, One only Elias knew how to access an old Villari key code, hidden within the gift she had once left for him, the crystal flower. That night, Elias used it to bypass the palace grid and access the private files of the matron's vault, searching not for secrets of war, but proof of peace messages, recordings, and entries showing Aralea's private counsel with her mother, revealing that Aralea had never declared intent to wed him or any human, but only sought to understand what her people feared. And among those records, Elias found something else, an old law, buried under centuries of dust, stating that any accusation made against a guest of royal interest must be brought before the throne in public, with the princess present, and this gave him one chance, a slim one, but a chance. He sent a message to the matron herself, invoking the old right, knowing she would be furious, but also knowing that law bound even her. Aralea returned the next day, eyes blazing not with fear, fury, having heard the rumors, seen the blocked trails, and walked through crowds of people who now spoke her name like a curse or a question. She stormed into the throne chamber as Elias stood before the council once more, demanding to hear the charges in her presence, and Velcher's smile faltered just slightly as she took her seat with her crest displayed fully and her voice sharp. "If there are accusations against a man I have invited, then speak them to me, or speak them to no one." What followed was hours of cold words, soft threats, and carefully chosen lies, but Aralea dismantled them one by one, using not just logic, but memory. She spoke of each conversation, each meeting, each piece of time she had spent with Elias, and how none of it matched the narrative now being shaped. She didn't claim love, not yet, but she claimed truth, and sometimes that was more powerful in the eyes of a people trained to believe love was weakness. The council could not win in open view, and so they retreated, stating that the matter would be postponed. But everyone knew what that meant. They would try again from a darker angle, with sharper blades. Aralea, now exposed in her defiance, walked beside Elias after the session and said, "They will not stop until one of us breaks." And Elias answered, "Then we don't let them break us, only bend." And she gave him a small smile, tired but real. Yet far above them, in the upper chambers of the old observatory, Velcher and his allies spoke of older methods, ones that did not require approval, and one name was whispered among them, a name even the stars seemed to fear, the Red Seer, a shadow from Villari's bloodiest days, once thought banished, now considered their last resort. Elias and Aralea had won the chamber, but the real game had just begun, and old blood never forgets. The palace no longer whispered, it growled beneath its golden skin, as if something ancient had awakened, and the people, both noble and servant, moved with a heavy air of dread pressing against their thoughts. For rumors had begun to spread that the trial of flame and flesh, a rite not used in over 200 years, was being considered once more, and it was no ordinary judgment. It was a brutal test of spirit, memory, and truth, one that could not be faked, could not be lied through, and more importantly, could not be survived without suffering. Elias had heard only faint tales of it during his earliest diplomatic briefings, spoken with a kind of nervous awe, for this trial was not bound by the laws of councils or thrones. It was older, sacred, and entirely final, and when Aralea arrived at his chamber with tight lips and burning eyes, He already knew what she was going to say before her voice whispered, "They've chosen the path of blood," and he asked softly, "Are they sure?" And she shook her head and said, "Velcher convinced the matron it's been signed in silence, sealed in the old tongue, which meant it was done irreversible, and what followed would either clear Elias's name in the eyes of the Dominion or destroy him completely." The trial was to take place in the Hall of Ancestral Fire, a place buried deep beneath the palace, carved into the living rock of the mountain on which the royal home had been built, and none could enter it save the accused, the chosen witness, and the circle of flame, a group of ancient judges who spoke little, moved slower than time, and existed only for this purpose. When Elias was led down into the fire-lit depths, past heavy iron doors and walls that hummed with energy, he saw that even the guards feared this place. Their eyes turned from the flame-carved symbols that pulsed along the floor, and as he stepped into the circular chamber, the temperature shifted, not from heat alone, but from pressure, as if the room itself demanded truth. The circle of flame, cloaked in robes of deep red and gold, sat in silence as Elias stood at the center ring, a circle carved into the floor with thin veins of molten stone. And when Aralea entered as his witness, a gasp echoed from somewhere. Unseen, for no princess had ever stood as witness in such a trial, not since the ancient wars, and her presence was more than unusual. It was dangerous, and yet she stood tall, unafraid, her crest removed, dressed in simple white, her voice steady as she declared, "I stand for the truth, and the truth stands beside me." The circle did not speak with mouths, but with thought, voices pressing into Elias's mind like distant thunder, asking questions that were not said but felt. "Why have you come? What have you done? What do you hide?" And Elias answered not with words, but with memory, for the trial worked by drawing out the mind's truth and casting it into firelight, and one by one his memories came alive in the chamber, his arrival on Velaria, his first sight of Aralea, the tension of the court, the warnings, the poison, the quiet stares, and through it all, the growing understanding between him and the princess. And with each memory cast in flame, the judges watched, unmoving, but the heat grew fiercer, the light sharper, and suddenly the fire began to twist, showing not only his thoughts, but his fears, his moments of doubt, the times he had almost given in, almost run, and Elias gritted his teeth as the heat licked at his skin, not burning him in flesh, but burning his mind, forcing him to face everything he had hidden, even from himself. Aralea watched with pain in her eyes, knowing that what Elias endured was not just test, but torment. And still he stood, sweat pouring down his face, breath ragged, eyes locked on the flame as it showed one final memory, Aralea's hand in his, her voice whispering, "They won't break us." And then the fire stopped, and silence returned. For a long time, no one spoke, not even the circle, and then one of the robed figures rose and stepped forward, placing a single hand upon Elias's chest, not violently, but gently, and in that moment, Elias felt something strange, a cooling calm, like ice beneath skin. And then the figure spoke aloud for the first time. "The truth has been seen," and turned to Aralea, saying, "And so has yours." For in standing as witness, she too had been judged. And the figure returned to the circle, now joined by the others, who lowered their heads in unison and announced, "The bond is not false. The charge is broken. The trial is ended. The flames dimmed, the chamber cooled, and Elias fell to one knee, not from injury but from exhaustion, as Aralea rushed forward, catching him just before he collapsed fully. Above them, the palace guards received the verdict with disbelief, and Vulture, who had waited outside with a mask of patience, felt his hands clench behind his back, his plans unraveling before him. But he was not done, not yet, for even if the trial had cleared Elias, Vulture's reach was not bound by fire or law, only ambition. Later that night, as Elias rested under constant watch, the princess stood on the highest balcony, wind tugging at her robes, her thoughts heavy with what came next, for the trial had freed him, yes, but it had also bound them together in the eyes of the people, and that meant war or union, with no middle path. Far below, in the shadows of the city, an old vessel stirred in its berth, painted black and red with no flag on its hull, and inside, cloaked in silence, the Red Seer awakened for the first time in a century, summoned by blood and fear, and his first words were not to the stars or the council, but to the cold air itself, "Bring me the human, and burn what remains." The trial was over, but the reckoning had just begun. The city of Villaria did not sleep that night, for the news of Elias surviving the trial of flame and flesh spread like wildfire across the stars, shaking even distant colonies who had once believed humans to be fragile, forgettable things. And now the whispers told of one who stood in sacred fire and emerged with truth on his skin, and the princess at his side. Aralea knew this moment would change everything Villaria's future, the balance of power in the Dominion, and perhaps even the way humans were seen beyond their small blue world. But even as celebration hummed through parts of the palace, a deep shadow still moved through its corridors, silent and cruel, and its name was the Red Seer. Summoned from exile by Vulture and his allies in desperation, the seer had not walked among the court in over 100 years, yet now he drifted between walls like smoke, speaking only to those who shared his thirst for control. And when Vulture stood before him in the secret chamber below the West Tower, the seer said only one sentence: "Truth is not enough to rule," before showing him a plan too old to be written, one that involved not Elias's death, but the breaking of the people's hope, and that meant breaking Aralea herself. Meanwhile, Elias remained under high guard in the royal chambers, but no chains held him, only the weight of his new position. For his survival had forced the Dominion Council to recognize him as more than a guest, and now the ancient Villari law of resonance had been invoked by the matron herself, declaring that if a bond had formed between the princess and the foreigner, it must be sealed or dissolved before the next phase of succession, and to dissolve it would require one of them to lie in front of the full council, which neither of them could do without shattering all they had built. Aralea stood in her war robes the next morning, facing a sea of advisers, ambassadors and governors, their faces masked with politics, but burning with curiosity, as she declared with a steady voice that she would choose union not because she was forced, but because the truth had chosen her. And Elias, brought beside her, gave no speech, no grand display, only a quiet nod, and in that silence the chamber felt something shift, as if something old had finally fallen away. Yet above, in the high balcony behind the veil, Vulture whispered to the seer, "Now," and the plan began, for while the ceremony of union was sacred, it was also vulnerable. And on the day the stars aligned for the royal binding, an event that would be broadcast to over 70 systems, the Red Seer moved through the crowd in the form of a hooded servant, carrying not weapons but words, for his power lay not in blades but in minds, and his plan was to shatter Elias's spirit from within. Just before the final vow was to be spoken, Elias was taken aside by a quiet messenger bearing the mark of the palace seal, and told Aralea had called for him privately in the solar chamber. But when he arrived, the chamber was empty, save for the Red Seer himself, who stood at the center, surrounded by ancient glyphs and glowing symbols, and said in a soft, echoing voice, "She has not chosen you." Before casting a psychic illusion into Elias's mind visions of Aralea laughing with Vulture, of her naming Elias a tool, of her mocking the bond, and though Elias knew these were false, the strength of the visions brought him to his knees, the heat of betrayal searing through him, and the seer pressed deeper, feeding on Elias's doubt, whispering, "You are a puppet in a grand play." But then something unexpected happened. The fire that had once tested Elias now rose again, not from the chamber, but from within him, the residue of the trial, and it burned the illusion from his mind with a sharp flare of light. And Elias stood slowly, his voice calm as he said, "Your tricks are old," and struck the floor with his foot, activating the emergency beacon Aralea had placed in his boot. In moments, the solar guard burst into the chamber, weapons drawn, and the seer vanished into smoke, leaving only a scorched mark where he had stood. The ceremony resumed, shaken but not broken, and this time Elias and Aralea stood without interruption before the heartlight crystal, where the final vow was made, not of love alone, but of shared will, shared burden, and a future chosen freely. When the crystal turned from silver to blue, the universe itself seemed to pause, for such a bond had never before occurred between a Velari royal and a human, and the energy that surged from the ritual was felt even in orbit, where the ships of Earth and Velaria watched with awe. The seer, watching from a hidden vessel, hissed with rage, not because they had stopped him, but because they had changed the story. This union was no longer just a scandal. It was now a legend, and legends could not be undone so easily. Back on Earth, the United Human Federation declared a day of celebration, and Velaria responded with an open trade pact, while millions across both species sent messages of hope and wonder. But deep in the shadow corners of the galaxy, there were those who saw the Union not as peace, but as a threat to the old way. And the seer's final words to Vulture before vanishing into the void were clear. A star can be moved, but not without shaking the sky. For now, though, peace held, and Elias stood beside Aralea not as a prince, nor as a conqueror, but as an equal chosen not by war, but by fire and truth. And when he looked out over the star fields from the high balcony that night, he whispered, "We did not just survive, we changed the stars." And Aralea, taking his hand, answered, "Then let them burn bright."